Sameep Padora was born in 1974 in Chamba in northern India. He grew up in Mumbai, where he studied architecture at the Academy of Architecture in Mumbai. Graduating in 1996, he was then accepted into SciArc in Los Angeles, a city that encouraged his interest in the work of such architects as Tom Main, Michael Rotondi, Eric Owen Moss, and Frank Israel. But when he started his studies there in 1999, he got really disappointed, and he stayed there for just about one semester. He went because he didn't see the connection to where he was coming from. And again, so there was this global, regional kind of disjunction. So he went back. He worked. He worked on projects in India, and then already in 2005, he decided to come back to the U.S. and he started his studies at JSD. Graduated, stayed here for about half a year, and then went back to India. So he started his practice in 2007, and that's where so it's called Sameep Padora and Associates. And I will let him talk about his own work. The only thing I want to still mention is that when I interviewed him last month, there is a quote. He said, "We don't want our buildings to remain unchanged. Quite the opposite. We want them to transform, whether by people or nature, in ways that we haven't imagined before." So please welcome Sameep Padora. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Vladimir, for the introduction. Thanks, Maurizio, for setting this up. I'm delighted to be here. This is, it's actually a talk that I'm going to be doing at the GST, but in a slightly more kind of research-oriented version of. But today, what I'm going to do is just talk about the practice in general. So like Vladimir mentioned, I studied in LA back in the early 2000s at SciArc. And I left because I was disappointed by what I was assuming would be a kind of furthering of my intellectual development through the master's program. But what I really saw was little more than kind of compositional variation of ways to kind of put materials together, maybe at the maximum. So I went back to India and started working for a while. I did a couple of projects where I worked with local masons and craftsmen to build a few projects in the rural parts of our country. After that, I came back here to study at GST, and where I didn't do studio again. I actually wanted to understand what was the background for what produces architecture. And really my interest led me to do courses in project finance and to look at how low-income housing projects are structured. So it was a fantastic experience, and I think I learned a lot more about India at GST than I did while I was working in India itself. And it was interesting that it's been 15 years since, and I think also what's the title of my talk is An Engineer of Thinking points to is over these past 15 years, while one is kind of talking about having worked in India, but I'm also wondering if what I learned while I studied here, went back and took back, is there something that today I can actually say is also is a value system that I can also kind of talk about and its relevance within the kind of Western world in some sense, right? So that's really that's a big question that I kind of started off with. The presentation itself today is in three parts. It really talks in the beginning about models of practice, the second on certain rural projects that we worked on, and thirdly, the idea of the city and its development within the context of our country. Going back to the cliche that India is diversity, while it's a cliche, but it's also completely true. Language, clothing, culture, changes every 200 kilometers, right? So this diversity is also kind of plugged into an incredible range of geographical context, right? From the mountains to the sea, within the mountains, many other kind of versions of microclimates, so on and so forth. And this creates a kind of architectural tapestry that is also extremely varied, right? And yet, while we have this kind of richness as a response to this kind of this variated context, there are challenges. Our cities are places where you can actually see the manifestation of inequity, of class divide. And while this is obviously very stark in the way that you see it in images here, but it's also symptomatic of development throughout the world. Really. I mean, it's not something that is peculiar to to India. And you're also asking yourself that in this kind of context of urbanization, what is the mandate or what is the role of an architect? To step back a little bit, I'm going to look at the role of the architect over time. When in 1947, the extreme left, when India achieved independence, the architect was this kind of nation builder, right? He was a part of the entire kind of the project of building India. In 1975, when the emergency happened, a lot of mandate was taken by the authoritarian figure of Indira Gandhi, who was the PM then. And the architect and other professionals like the architect start losing some of that fire, that mandate, or that social will to be a part of implementing the change, because the state just becomes extremely dictatorial. Then in 1991, what happens is economic liberalization, market economy comes to India. So India, which has largely been a socialist-driven economy till the 1990s, has its economic borders kind of open up. And what also happens is with this kind of inflow of capital, what you end up getting really is an incredible rate of change. Impatient capital, as Rahul Mehrotra calls it, dictates a certain kind of speed in the implementation of the global project or the economic project. And what happens is architects then are doing little more than just being service providers to implement projects that appease a kind of image from the client end, which could be anywhere. It's the image of global capital manifested in buildings of glass and steel. Right? But now it's been 35 years since, and really the point that I'm trying to make through this diagram is that we've had enough time to actually think about what the role of the architect is, and perhaps this becomes a way for us also to question what the role of the architect could be. This is a diagram. It's actually a research project that we exhibited at the Seoul Biennale in 2019, where we mapped the kind of practices that were emerging in India, where the traditional architectural practice was no longer the only mode of operation. And there were ways that people were now starting to address issues of inequity, of development, of rapid degradation of the environment, through their practice models that were completely different from what the traditional model of practice was. So really with this background, I'm going to start that first part of my presentation, which talks about the models of practice that we are kind of working through. The first of these is the idea of a traditional practice, where a client comes to us to do a project, but while we're doing that project, in the case of this carpet pavilion, we're also looking into ways of production, means of production that the city has that are latent, that are not necessarily forgotten, but they're slowly disappearing over time. And we then work with what is, in some sense, a kind of craft to be able to create this kind of pavilion, which actually uses waste carpet, but also reinvents the kind of lifetime or the life cycle of that carpet as well. Or in the case of a project like this, where we built a house in northern India on the peri-urban, well, in the kind of peri-urban context, the architecture of the house itself becomes a means for us to also start suggesting a kind of ordering of what seems to be an extremely haphazard edge to the city as it is today. The second model of practice that we typically kind of move through is this idea of a collaborative practice. In the case of this small temple that we designed, and temples are actually extremely, how should I say, embedded in the cultural memory of the people that actually go to these projects. So here we actually worked with a group of 3 villages to design and build a temple out of stone with using techniques that had been forgotten. So we really kind of were, in some sense, editors trying to kind of look at a model of design and build that would have a very active involvement from the people who were going to use the project. So the villagers actually built the project themselves, which took a little bit more time, but it also kind of created a sense of belonging that would have been difficult to create otherwise. The third model of practice that we kind of operate through this idea of collectives, what we've done is we've actually kind of structured a group of 6 practices that look at doing only public projects for the city of Mumbai, where many times this work is pro bono. But what we are trying to do is trying to create another level of engagement that doesn't exist in the city today, where the government literally hires contractors to do city projects without any kind of design intervention. So what we've been trying to do as a group called the Bandra Collective is that we are actually working with resident groups to, of course, do design interventions like parks and so on and so forth, but also to do advocacy projects where we look at infrastructure, for instance, in this case, which is this massive coastal road that's being built along Mumbai's western edge that will completely cut the city off from its water side. And to bring these images into public domain, to actually use this information to be able to build resistance against projects like this. So that's the third model of practice, the idea of the collective and what it enables us to do. And the last model of practice is this idea of research, as a mode to operate through, where there is an incredible amount of there's an incredible lack of information actually, on our cities. And what we're trying to do through this project is really try to see, to address, this idea of housing and affordability, and how there already existed certain models of housing in the city of Mumbai that again have been forgotten or have been kind of completely glossed over, and to try and see if we can learn from those models and bring that idea back into kind of in a projective sense to look at the design of affordable housing going forward. So that's really these 4 models of practice, like I said, but it's not like these models operate almost kind of individually, or they're not kind of siloed. They also are constantly informing and learning from each other. The second part of the presentation really talks about the projects that lie beyond the urban, in some sense. Of course, Lefebvre said this back in the 1970s that however disconnected you might be from urban centers, you're still part of urbanization networks and that kind of link. So that's really interesting. But what also happens is, as architects, our only intervention within this kind of context is through projects that are kind of second homes, farmhouses, because the rest of the country, and now India is 35% of India's population actually lives in cities, only 35%. 65% is rural. And if you would kind of look at what that means just in terms of development indices, there is a huge disconnect. And yet India is one of the few countries that where it is mandated by law that companies above a certain scale are supposed to compulsorily spend a certain amount of their profits as CSR, which is corporate social responsibility. So invest that into social projects to improve society. And all of this money really is of course kind of put into use, but it's not really, let's say, it's not articulated in a way that can create systemic benefits. So this first project really is a project that comes out of that nature of process. It's actually a project that is meant, and this is a kind of diagram that talks about the Indian caste system. It's a kind of caste system is a kind of segregation initially based on profession, but eventually it also becomes a class divide, right? It becomes the people at the bottom most were the ones that were the most disenfranchised, and they were also the ones that had the greatest lack of opportunities. One of India's architects of the constitution of independence, Dr. Ambedkar, he actually was a great advocate for the improvement of the Dalit community, which is the lowest caste in our kind of caste hierarchy. And he actually kind of created this entire conversion that allowed Dalits to no longer be a part of that caste system, but to move to become Buddhists. And today, the Dalit representation in our political, let's say, in the political economy of the country is quite high, but yet development indices are very, very low. And this project that we've actually done is actually for a community of Dalits. Bauds, Ambedkar Bauds as they are called. And it's a community center where besides meditation, they also kind of do skill development. So it's actually a community center that's also providing real life skills to people from this community to learn and kind of better their own lives. It's actually in a part that of rural Maharashtra, Western India, where this gentleman on the extreme left has a kind of sugar plant, and a lot of these people who live there work in that plant. And what he wanted to do was really provide this community center where people from all religions can come. So it was supposed to be completely kind of open. The site actually is located in a grove right next to his plant, and it's thickly forested, like you can see, like that. And yet, while we were trying to develop an architecture for this site, because of the dense foliage, we were also trying to see if there were clues that we could pick up on whether we could actually create an architecture that allows you to, while being internal inside, also visually links you to the foliage of trees outside. So this is really a small guest house that was close to our site that we experienced, which led us to this idea of looking at the insertion of the architectural section within that space to be reversed, so that when you're inside, you're still being able to connect with the foliage of the trees outside. And as a kind of planning idea, it's really very simple. It actually is just a series of two halls, one a meditation hall, the other a skill development center, a little admin block, and three dormitories for teachers to stay in. And there are two courtyards that structure the entire project. We worked extensively with the local community to show them what we were planning to do, and we had a lot of back and forth with them. We brought in Hunarshala, which is a group that won the Curry Stone Prize here back in 2008 or 2009. They essentially train local communities to work with local material to build, and that's the kind of material ecology of the project that we developed with them. We actually ended up using waste stone dust from a basalt quarry close by, along with fly ash from the plant, to create walls that were rammed of stone dust walls. So they are basically volcanic stone dust walls that are rammed in place to create a kind of new material which we hope will become systemic for construction in this area. The wood is all recycled from old shipping vessels that are broken down close by. And what you actually see now are images of the ramming process of the walls being set in, various kind of mixes giving us various textures. And that's really a structural diagram of the project with two brick piers at either end with a gutter, and which also kind of holds the structure of the roof, the wooden roof, and the stone dust walls along the periphery. These are just images of those shipping vessels that were broken. That was the wood that came out of it. That's the wood now on our site being structured into a roof, sitting in the middle on the gutter. The entire underside of the roof is actually made of old jute bags that are wrapped around a twig and then mixed with mud to create these rolls of mud that become insulation layers underneath. So what you see here is the insulation layer in place, and then the roof going up, the bricks being deep jointed, and the floors being done out of a combination of mud and dung. Again, this is a kind of local material technique, which allows for the villagers to also have a connect with the project over time, because this needs to be done at least twice a year. So it creates a kind of economy that also helps sustain the local community. And these are images of the final project. What you see that little girl touching is actually that stone dust wall, and you can see how the material is extremely tactile. It kind of lends itself to kind of engagement in some sense. And that's that concrete gutter sitting on the brick pier. So it's actually a very clear structural diagram, but what it allows us to do is also carry all of that water away to harvest, because this is an area with very little rainfall. What you see here is at the inauguration, people sitting in the prayer hall. That's the entire construct. You see the insulation layer under. And that's what we actually started off with, where we were talking about this idea of being able to connect with the foliage outside while you sat within the project. So that's really what we set out to do, and that's how it works. What we've also done is that while the kind of structural diagram is very strict, it still allows us to respond to trees that sit within our site, which are the most important part of the beginning of the project, really, because of the fact that the trees obviously were there before we were, but the idea is Jetwan is also a kind of holy grove in Buddhist mythology, and for which we actually kind of try to kind of work around all these trees. And they manifest in various places. The entire structure really kind of responds to the presence of those trees, and you can actually see how some of those spaces are, and how that entire courtyard really becomes a kind of social space for people to use at various times of the day. The second project that I'm going to show is a library that we've done as an extension to a small school, again in rural Maharashtra, where while building this library for children, what we were trying to think about was what do children relate to more? Is it a building with vertical building or landscape, right? I mean, the answer was the fact that if even as an adult, if I was to kind of look at a berm or a mound, my first impulse would be to climb on it. And we set out to do exactly that. We set out to kind of create an architecture that was also simultaneously landscape. But to do this, what we ended up doing was actually going back to 16th century Spain, the Catalan tile molding system, right? I mean, Gustavino built all of that, here as well. And to then look at how the Este in Uruguay was also doing these tension ring details, which allowed us to do these compression structures in brick. And then using a construction software from the ETH Zurich, we were able to calculate the compression in this building. And finally, using the material, in Maharashtra, we were able to build this project in India. So the point that I'm also trying to make here is that the global and the local are no longer in opposition. They don't need to be. We already sit on knowledge networks now that will allow us to use knowledge systems that might exist in different parts of the world, but could make the local richer if we think about it as in that way. And this is really a site plan of the school. This was where our site was located at. And what we were trying to do was trying to imagine the library to be really a kind of crossroads for students from the upper part of that school to actually move to playgrounds that sat on this lower edge here. So we really were trying to see if this building could also be a pavilion of sorts that people could move through. And these are just some drawings of that. It's really a simple construction technique of 3 layers of brick tile that are always in compression. And these are some mock-ups of the initial project with testing. And as you might know that when you do a curved structure, the most expensive part about the structure is the formwork. And what we were trying to do here, or what we did here, was actually use rebar as formwork, which once our first layer had settled, the contractor removed the rebar and used that rebar to construct another project, another location. So our formwork cost was 0. So that's really, in some sense, frugality that actually becomes extremely important when we look at building in a context like ours. And this is after that those rebars were taken off. The shell is 150 feet long. It's about 25 feet at its widest, and it's 4.5 inches thick, without any steel, so completely in pure compression. So the building really becomes a kind of landscape project. And what you see here in the interior is actually the windows were designed in a way that allowed us to create natural ventilation within the building. So the upper layer of all of those fenestrations are mesh, so it allows for air to move through, and the lower layer, the lower layer is glass. But what also happens is, because of the fact that we stylated the entire the edge of the windows, we were able to use thinner sections. So we used less material than we would have used if the entire thing was one continuous line. So it's also, again, because it's in compression completely, we couldn't anchor any of the windows to the top. So all of the windows are actually anchored to the ground. So if you kind of see in some images, you can tell that there is a slight gap between the window and the entire ceiling. So various scales of spaces for kids to sit in and read. And also even things like the fan is kind of built off the stack, the book stack, because we didn't want to touch the roof of the building. And yeah, you can see how that works. The third project that I'm showing within this category is another temple that we actually built. It's again in rural South India, and it's built within a context that is agrarian, but it also has a big steel plant, cement plant there, for which they're quarrying. So you can actually see these little quarries with water accumulating in them, because the quarrying process itself needs water to actually cut through the stone. So what we were trying to see when we were designing this temple was if we could use that water that was being generated as a byproduct and it just evaporating within the kind of body of the temple. And it also went back in for us in history to see how this relationship between water and land within traditional temple architecture in India is very critical, whether it's through the idea of the ghat or the idea of the kund, which is a step water body. So we were really trying to see if we could actually begin with this idea of that step between the water and the land, and to see if that can become the architecture of the temple itself. In terms of a plan, it's really very simple. You kind of enter towards the left. There is a traditional east-west axis in which the main deity sits. There is a smaller deity that sits towards the western edge, and on top there is the priest's quarters with a little kitchen where the food is kind of cooked to kind of give all the devotees who come through this temple. And while we were doing that, what we also did was we structured the low-lying area around our temple project to also become a receptacle for all the water that was coming out of the quarrying process. So that water is basically used to recharge groundwater in this particular area. And whatever excess water comes out of this is then kind of diverted to the farmlands around the area to kind of help the farmers irrigate their crops. So again, while the program is really just a very simple temple project, but what we are being able to do is adding layers of other programs that are not directly related to the temple program itself, but have a relation within the context that we are building. It allows us to create a kind of connect to the people around the project that would be difficult for us to actually do if we hadn't added that layer. So this is really a kind of top view of the temple, and that's the context. You can see the steel plant in the background. You can see the overflow. You can see the water within our kind of pond, and then the overflow that actually kind of runs off into the fields. And what Vladimir actually kind of said in the beginning, it's really important for us to be able to let people take over the project. Finally, there is when you look at temple architecture, there is a certain distance that the user has from the deity or from the object. But what we are also trying to do by introducing these steps is to be able to, in some sense, change that distance, to be able to create a much more intimate experience between the user and the actual project itself. So it also becomes a kind of amphitheater looking outwards. But it's that single device, it's that one step that really turns into the architecture for the entire project. And that's the interior image of the corbelled stone, limestone that actually is locked into place with that skylight detail that allows light to come in. So This is a kind of drawing off the project where what we were trying to kind of also talk about is how these cultural elements of the temple and its planning really become a means for us to also connect back into the landscape through the kind of device of water and its cycle. The last bit of my presentation looks at the city itself. And as you know, there have been so many conversations on the city. I mean, Rahul's talked about the kinetic city. There is Richard Sennett's talked about open cities. There are some books on Bombay, like Maxim City, that talks about you know, the kind of dynamics of what makes a city like Bombay operate. And while there are these incredible definitions of what Mumbai could be, but there is also evidence of various kinds of programs that are emergent, that talk about the dynamic of a city like Mumbai, separate from a kind of top-down planning concept of what you know, Western planning typically comprises of. So there is the Dabbawalas, for instance, who were very simply transporting lunch boxes from houses to people in their offices, but doing that across the city of Bombay without making a single mistake, so much so that they had a 6 Sigma rating that only, I think, Toyota probably had besides them. So, you know, things like that, where Dharavi was a $600 billion economy in 2015, I think, where 60% of Mumbai's population either walks or cycles to work. So there are instances, or there are emergent characteristics that point towards kind of native or embedded intelligence that we can see, but we don't know how to kind of you know, articulate in a manner that can be projective. And of course, then there is a question of housing. Right? So for us, housing really became the kind of point of, let's say, entry into thinking about cities. So there is there's a big political intent of building, let's say, 20 million homes, right, within India. And while there is tremendous political intent, this is what gets built in the name of housing. Right? It's literally warehouses for people. To look at this notion of housing, what we started doing was going back into the history of the city to find what were the kinds of models of housing that already existed for the past 150 years, and to see if we could actually dissect them, analyze them, to look at them through the metrics of social space, of movement, of unit size, of unit change over time, to find that there were commonalities that emerged from that research that suggested a new way of looking at affordable housing within Mumbai. Some of these projects are incredible. This is a mixed-use project, which is roughly 3/4 the size of a Manhattan city block, owned by a single owner. It's got a market street at the bottom, and it's got residential units at the top. And what's interesting is, as opposed to other similar mixed-use developments in the city, today, here, the streets actually allow you to shortcut from one part of the city to the next. City does not stop at the edge of the plot. It actually continues all the way through. And above, you actually have these residential units that have courtyards in between them and bridges that connect you across. Built in the built in 1896, 1898. It still survives today, and it's an incredibly beautiful project, but phasing out shortly. So the idea of networks was important in that project. In this project, which is a very simple courtyard unit with corridors on both sides and units across the corridor, the critical part of the project was the fact that people spoke about how, when they stayed in these units, despite having formal housing with an elevator in another location, they still preferred living here in a walk-up, because if they had a problem, they could call out to anybody, and people from any floor would come and help them. And this was something that was, the sense of community was something that they clearly understood was not available in new developments within the city. There was what we also found was this idea of a proportion, a width to a height ratio that allowed people to communicate easily across that courtyard. That was extremely important to develop that kind of social infrastructure. Or in the case of this housing that was built by the state, Over time, there has been a lot of change in the housing itself, where people have gradually extended their homes, coming outwards, adding units, such that the entire facade of the project is actually a study in almost an architecture of extension, of being able to accommodate new programs that are added. So what you actually see here are new rooms that were added to an existing unit inside by the residents directly. And if you think that this is a very, it's a very kind of sporadic or very organic way of doing things, it's actually a very, very kind of structured and precise way of creating additional programs. And so it's this idea that that housing also needs to be extendable. It needs to, the systems that we actually put into place should allow for this kind of change over time. And finally, the fact that it's also about the small things, the little things, like this little ladder detail is about 100 years old. It actually has just 2 hinges, across this piece of wood, allows the ladder to completely fold against the wall and access, whenever you open it up, you can access a mezzanine. So it's this kind of attention to detail that is important when we start looking at the architecture of housing, especially small homes. But at a kind of macro level, there is a clear shift in the focus of housing in the city, where project scales are changing. The attention to who you're trying to house is also changing, and who loses out in this is typically the lower income groups. And what we're trying to also dissect here is what is the building code that actually allows for that kind of housing to be built. So our new research looks at the history of Mumbai's development over time through its building code, and to see what kind of semantics actually are in operation to create certain kinds of architecture within the city. This is Decoding Mumbai. The book actually comes out in a month's time. So that's really the kind of research. So the notion of research, again, as far as the city is concerned, is also a means for us to, as architects, inform ourselves better of ways to intervene within the city. And then to kind of start looking at the architecture of a few projects. This is a small building a residential building that we've done in a city in South India, where we're actually kind of, where we built the entire project by replanning the interior of the space. But the client had actually come to us at a point where he had already gotten the envelope approved. So we're really working within a kind of precise edge. But what we're trying to see is if we could also start looking at that edge to become performative, to be able to create an architecture that responds to climate, where the walls could corbel outwards to take the weight of the sunbreaker. So the facade is not just a kind of separation, but it's also a means to negotiate climate. And of course, there is a kind of entire system to do that. We can drafted all of this on the computer. We kind of did our exercises in terms of how much that corbel needed to be, but yet we have to construct on site. And you're working with masons who don't read drawings like this, right? So what it meant was we actually had to design low-tech tools. Right? So these are simple templates, wooden templates, that allow the mason to corbel the brick just by the right amount. So, and be able to then kind of, work on the skin in manners that actually allows you to do that. So you can see the brick corbelling to take the weight of the sunbreaker. So while the project, of course, is about the way that the wall corbels and it takes the it takes the load of the sunbreaker as well, but it's also about just simply looking at the design of the tool. So it's as much about the design of the tool as much as it is about the design of the building. The last project that I'm going to show is another project in a tier 2 city in India, in Western India now, where there is already a very strong kind of architectural presence. Right? The architecture of these screens, of these lookout balconies, it's already something that is concretized through cultural memory and artifacts. And if you were to trace the kind of development of that form, it comes from a small rural house in the hinterland, which over time changed into that courtyard format, So that gated enclave then turns into that final image of the project that you see. That is that creates an entire kind of cityscape that is extremely variated and rich, built out of stone. And yet the city, the contemporary city, is this, right? There is a complete kind of separation, and I mean we can kind of discuss it's the the kind of the domino diagram and how that kind of manifests this kind of reality. But what we were trying to do, in some sense, when we were trying to build these student hostels, was trying to see if we could actually create porosity within that extremely dense fabric, and to see if the section of the building allows the building to actually breathe. So. What you see here are just multi-level plans, but you can see the changing kind of porosity of those plans as we kind of keep going higher. And that is the final project. Again, working with a local kind of stone to develop these lookout balconies and those screens that allow you to get cooler air into the buildings, and creating those additional terraces that allows for students to kind of congregate in these outdoor spaces. And as you enter, that's the kind of central courtyard. There is a kind of bridge that connects at some level above. But what's also interesting, and this is something that that escapes documentation in the plan, that there is a sectional connect of people being able to communicate across floors within our cities as well, where the outdoor is extremely, let's say, networked or extremely connected to the interior through people and their interactions. And where this connection is something that we were trying to kind of work through in the building as well. These are some images of the hostel rooms and the light that comes in through the jali, and the way that that building sits within that the new fabric in some sense. So it's really this kind of juxtaposition of multiple programs, multiple influences, contexts that are not necessarily geographically locked, but they're also able to kind of open up conversations about material, about time, and geography. So I'm just going to finish with the last a couple of slides where this is really where we kind of started off with, or what I was trying to kind of put together. Obviously, I've just kind of taken a few projects, but the responses, in some sense, kind of come back to the title slide. Is there an Indian way of thinking? And this is actually an essay by this incredible writer, philosopher, historian called A.K. Ramanujan, who talks about how there cannot be a single monolithic way to imagine this idea of India, that by emphasizing in the same sentence, re-emphasizing a different word, when you say, is there an Indian way of thinking, you're also asking simultaneously, was there an Indian way of thinking? If there is an Indian way, also questions the singularity of that effort. So what he basically kind of puts into play here is that the fact that the only real question of identity should be actually replaced with this idea of diversity, that the monolith is no longer operational. It's really subjectivity, and the kind of sum of the parts that actually are in some sense greater than the whole. Thank you.
Okay, so let me just maybe try to encourage you to ask questions. Before you think about questions, maybe I should ask something. I think it's important to realize that architects definitely work in a very specific conditions. There is local culture, local climate, and even politics involved. And I want to ask you, how do you, you didn't really touch, and maybe you could explore a little bit later, maybe some of the questions of the specific designs of your projects. But before that, maybe if you could talk about how do you go after projects? Where do you get projects? You don't have to talk about, in cases when it's a family member or a relative or whatever, a friend. But how do you go after other kinds of projects, more public projects? And before that, I just want to give you an example. For example, some years ago, I was working with Colombian architects on their socially minded projects in Colombia. And there was time when a lot of architects from around the world were noticing what was happening in Colombia, because that was really a reverse of what was happening in the Western world, because the mainstream architecture, the most interesting architecture that you would expect to find in the Western countries would be in the most central, the most exclusive kind of neighborhoods. In Colombia, it was completely reversed. If you wanted to see something interesting, you would have to go to the poorest neighborhoods and see social housing, libraries, playgrounds, what have you. But interestingly, when I interviewed a number of Colombian architects, and all of them lived in Colombia, but one of them came to New York and set up his practice here. And then I went to see his work, and it was a very interesting revelation, because the work that he was working on here was completely different. So I asked him, so how come you work on these beautiful social projects in Colombia and the whole world wants to learn from you? And then you come to New York, and what you do, you basically serve in the upper middle class building luxury condominiums in Brooklyn. So how do you explain that? Because many Colombian architects would say, we're not just architects, we are like politicians. We initiate projects. So if you initiate projects, why can't you do those kinds of projects in a different setting? Right? And he said that, well, the politics is different. We're not really politicians. So you have to work, with the local conditions. So what you're going to say, how you go after projects, doesn't mean that it's going to be applied elsewhere. But it's interesting to know how it works in India, how it works in Mumbai, especially public projects.
So there isn't really a culture of public projects being assigned through competition in the country. So it's, we've done 2 big competitions and won both of them, but neither of them have been built. So it's really not the route to take if you want to, kind of actually build something. In the case of the Bandra Collective, which is one of the models of practice I showed in the beginning, what we've been doing is actually working with resident groups, right, of that particular area to figure out what is it that they need from a project. Simultaneously, we are also talking to the local politician to understand, or at least kind of gauge what his need of political economy is given the life cycle of his term and the implementation range of the project. So I think there is one position that one can take of idealism, but it also has to be tempered by a kind of understanding of this kind of political economy. And I think that's possible to do. The other thing is, you also, I'm not really a kind of fan of authorship, so I actually think that if you can create distance between what the project needs to be and the fact that you author the project, as in you literally kind of draw it, you get a written project at the end, right? So for me, I think that is critical, that the project needs to kind of, in some sense, emerge from the dynamics of the various actors involved. And sometimes it results in the project, and sometimes it doesn't. For instance, I remember the first time when I returned to India to actually, planning to do a building in Bombay, I called a couple of people who I knew were building and said, I've come back to the US, I want to kind of try and do a project with you. They said, no, we are very happy with building with this mainstream commercial architect who's been doing our work forever. And I realized that was, it was stupid. I was naive of me to kind of even think that was possible, because the language that I was speaking was completely different. Design and real estate, or architecture and real estate, really was a difference between the conversation. So I think the research really becomes a means for us to also inform ourselves better. We can always kind of point towards the other side and say, they don't know, what we can do as designers. But I think it's also us designers that seem to take a kind of moral high ground that doesn't necessarily have its kind of feet within, the kind of dynamics of what actually occurs. So until we are not able to see the logic of the other side, I don't think we can come with a kind of better project. So that's really how we try to do through this kind of practice. It's not exactly the answer to your question.
Yeah, we have some questions.
Yeah, of course.
I just connecting with that. Can you talk more about your book, Decoding Mumbai?
Yeah. Yeah. So what happened was that when we did the first book, which was on housing typologies, we said that there was this fantastic history of these kind of buildings that no longer get built in the city, and why is that the case? And what we found was building regulations wouldn't allow that kind of building to happen today. So we were wondering how we got to that point. How did building regulations become counterproductive to creating good living environments? So we went back into the history of Mumbai to find how the first building laws were written. And it actually starts off at the time of the bubonic plague in 1896, where the first laws came into being, which talk specifically about creating more livable environments for the citizens of Mumbai. And to a point where today, in a recent research project, we found there's an NGO called Doctors for You that did this research where they found that every fifth member living in a government or state-built housing project suffered from respiratory diseases because of the architecture of the project, because the buildings were allowed to be built so close by that there wasn't enough light and ventilation. So we found that building codes actually came full circle. The first building codes were written to improve living conditions, and building codes today being written create adverse living conditions. So decoding Mumbai is really tracing the history of Mumbai's fabric through the development of its building code over time. So we use 20 projects to actually chronicle that. So yeah, that's really what decoding Mumbai is about.
So yeah, thank you so much for the lecture. The work is super beautiful.
Thank you.
I'm really struck by how deeply involved in building technologies, basically, and means and methods, and the process of not just designing the works, but then I would assume staying very involved in the production of the work. So in India, is that a conventional relationship that the architect would also direct the means and methods of the project? Or is that something you take on as part of your project of developing these beautiful new typologies?
Right. No. So actually, that's a great question. The thing is, within India, while we have the usual institutional structure for architectural professionals, but the process of construction actually is still rooted in its traditions of 200, 300 years old. There isn't the kind of mechanization or the intense kind of structuring that you see here, in the West. Because of this almost kind of loose framework of construction, as architects, there is a possibility for being involved a little bit more and being able to intervene in ways that could modulate the construction process in a way that creates a project that's richer because of the number of other actors that you can bring into the project. And what also I think is interesting is if, as an architect, you're able to distance yourself from the idea that what you say goes, right? Once you draw a line, that's what's going to be built. To be able to say that, this line that's built or this line that's drawn is open to take suggestions, influences from other actors in the project, whether it's a contractor, whether it's a mason, whether it's the client. And if you have a process that's open enough to do that, I think in the Indian context at least, we have that opportunity because of the fact that the construction process is not as set in stone as it is in the West. So the opportunity is there, but not many people still kind of build like that. So it's few, as you already know.
So
sorry, yes, she was saying.
And it's not necessarily a question, but I just wanted to say that I was very inspired by your Commendation. I'm from Mexico City. And sometimes, as much as I love Cooper, it's, I think Mumbai and Mexico City are similar in many ways in its diversity, its color, its way of life, and the austerity of New York, and sometimes the Western canon that's sort of ingrained in Western architecture schools is a bit hard to mitigate when you're from such a loud, colorful place. So yeah, I was really inspired by your commitment to reinvest into what India has to offer in architecture. And I've also, for the last sort of 5 months, been trying to, in a very simple undergraduate way, which will hopefully become something more in the future. I've been trying to track the history of housing in Mexico City.
Oh, that's great.
In the way that you've been doing with Mumbai, and it's so complicated because it's a city with so much colonial influence and rich architectural history that sometimes can't be separated from the colonial aspect.
Right.
And then ultimately, even in the 20th century, a lot of modern architects trying to fit modern ideas of housing into a society where family structures are very complex.
Right.
The 2 kids, 2 parents thing doesn't exist or work at all. So it's not really a question. It's really nice to see also the way that you bring sort of your culture into your drawings is super incredible. And I've never really, I haven't seen sort of like an architectural plan of a proposed temple, which is, something I'm sure happens a lot in India, but, that's not really something that happens here in New York. So I don't think I have a question, but just very inspired by all of the work that you're doing, because I'm quite fascinated with sort of what I've been trying to do here at Cooper and my experience at mitigating the Western architecture world, being from somewhere that's very much not that.
No, it's actually, thank you for the kind words, but what's also interesting is when you mentioned the temple and the drawings, this is not the way that temples in India get done, actually. So these are really exceptions. And while these are exceptions, what you're also treading is on very unfamiliar territory, because temples are also cultural artifacts that have now, with the kind of government that we have in the country, they're not just cultural artifacts, they're also political tools. And when we built this temple, and images of this were out online, I think we won some award, and there was something on Twitter and all of that. I immediately had right-wing trolls go after me, saying that this isn't a Hindu temple, right? This is something different, and you guys study the West, come back and kind of do kind of transfer all of this knowledge into these kind of strange things. And I was a little kind of taken aback, a little upset, because I wasn't really the kind of, and the entire water kind of idea wasn't kind of reflecting at all. And then until actually I got hit by left-wing trolls that started talking about how I was a temple builder advocating the right-wing project throughout the country. So it's really interesting that that these kind of variants, they are really the exception and not the norm. But one has to actually be a little careful about how you also kind of position them, because they're very, at this point, very ripe for appropriation. And unfortunately, we have to be very kind of aware of the political reality of what these projects can become. I'm glad.
Yeah, I love how architecture can provoke this kind of cross-cultural identities, and how these projects can enrich architecture as an overall project.
Yes, and really about that video you showed about the ladder, how ultimately, despite all of the chronology of typology and what all of the architects or the history of housing or whatever, the only thing that matters at the end is the way people inhabit it.
Absolutely.
People create their whole model that's given to them. So I thought that was.
Yeah, I mean that ladder would do IKEA proud. I mean, it's really it's really a fantastic device. I mean, it's so simple.
So I'll come back to you. So
Sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
I'm also in awe of the presentation because of its clarity in weaving together not only the site as site, but the social history, the time, so contemporary also the question, what is an Indian way of thinking, or what is a Colombian way of thinking, what is of the territory, what is of the people, but in a way that doesn't essentialize and really it's a weaving, like where are we at?
Right.
In that sense, because of that clarity, and because I'm seeing you bridge your understanding of what's happening to the local dimensions of how to build. What is your vision of educating? How would you educate people in New York?
That's a fantastic question. I think one of the challenges that I think that we are faced with in any kind of society that the standard is to try and homogenize, right? To put everybody in a bracket that can be described, easily. Right? And the truth is that none of us fit that, right? All of us have have multiple layers. Multiplicity, if anything, is the only kind of defining characteristic. And I think if within our schools we are able to understand, yes, this kind of diversity, maybe we have a sense of it because we actually experience it, but is there a way for us to actually concretize that through tools that allow us to, as students, to be able to understand, document, analyze, and maybe project this incredible diversity that we inhabit in our worlds? I think that in itself would be great. I mean, of course, how do you do that is a big question. But I definitely think it is to do with the fact that we shouldn't have to think about us as architects having all the solutions, right? I don't think that we do actually. Right? All we can do is just search for the right questions. And I think we are able to kind of create a structure to be able to teach that, just to ask the right questions. And that's enough. That's enough. Yeah. I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's.
So you had a question.
Martina is speaking from Mexico, I'm speaking from China.
Right.
And when Vladimir comments on the status of how China has been a site of experimentation and of kind of bound to end, unfortunately, so the first thing comes to mind when I think about the status of architecture in China, India, and most developing countries. First word is critical regionalism.
Right.
Then wait a second, it doesn't make sense.
Right.
It was coined by Frampton to describe a regionalization of modernism and adjustment to it.
Right.
And since then, we haven't really developed a way to describe the diversity that had come out of it.
For sure.
So in a way, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
In a way, we have not come up with a lexicon to describe the current situation states to its diversity in and of itself. But it still bugs us. Like, it's okay to describe Caesar as critical regionalist. It's okay to maybe, describe Anto, given the guy only has Kant books and Corbusier books. Kind of makes sense, but still I think it lingers.
Right.
Like in China, you still see, Kant, Scarpa. If you don't love those architects, get out of the door. You're not invited. So there's still that sort of, it becomes more like Rossi, perhaps, but it's based on a paradigm set by Europeans and by Americans.
Right.
And the question is is there a way to achieve those with Chinese symbolism? Right. And that's the whole discussion of it. What I really admire about your work is that you did investigations into residential typologies and organizational spaces in regards to inhabitation rather than symbolism, which is, I think, I commend on a lot of Chinese architects for doing great work, but there's still something unsettling.
Right.
That is, whenever they discuss about their project, is always being at the place, originalism, local materials, crafts, poetics. A word that most people in here will hate. It's like you don't go around and tell people you're the poet, right? but that's what we have learned to do them because we don't have other lexicons.
Right.
And sadly, we're losing the opportunity to continue on because of the crash of the building market and because there was never a marriage between real estate and architecture in China. There's always real estate is there. People live in this place. People live in there. Design houses for people who can afford to live elsewhere.
Right.
So I think there's a great opportunity coming up.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and
some sort of failures that we've had.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very important point that you raise, and it's a conversation that a lot of us have had in India as well. That this idea of critical regionalism, I think we need to break that up. I mean, we don't need to be defined by the idea of the regional, but really the idea of criticality. What is critical to what we produce? What is the real value that comes out of the project? And if we are able to say that I'm at the other end, I don't want to talk about politics at all. I just want to talk about the fact that when I'm living in that space, the guy who stays there, when he's inside the space, stays in a space that is naturally ventilated and is still 6 degrees to 7 degrees lower temperature than the 50 degrees 50 degrees Celsius that you have outside. And if I can create even that kind of change in a country like India and do it by using material, a lesser material, trying to do more with the same, with less material, I think I've done enough. I mean, and that's the criticality bit of the project. And really, the regionalism, I don't think is important because, like I was saying earlier, that the way that we are situated today, your network into knowledge in a way it's unprecedented, right? And if you're not being able to use that knowledge, to kind of enrich what you're trying to do at a particular place, then I think it's a failure of our efforts. So really, for me, I think what's important is value, nothing else. It's the kind of critical value.
Yeah, I wonder, great conversation, Chen Yang, and is also a student here. But I wonder if also part of the distinction that you bring to the conversation is this word, and I heard you use it several times during your lecture, of distance.
Right.
And so if in some ways when Chen Yang, when you think about the architects you mentioned, Zizek, Khan, Tadorando, there was no distance in those architects between themselves as authors and the work that they made. So the new kind of thing that you're bringing into this is the notion of a distance from your work without in any way kind of falsely surrendering the knowledge you bring to the project as an architect.
Right.
So, and the possibilities that you can imagine that perhaps other people involved in that operation can't. So I think it's pretty wild you using your local masons not to make brickwork that looks like traditional Indian work, but looks like Friado and Mannheim.
Right. Yeah.
So that's pretty wild.
Right.
And it kind of allows for the potential for that local knowledge to be used, but to never underestimate the new possibilities that exist within that local knowledge. And I think that's a particular skill and a particular way of approaching work.
So, you raise a great point because there is also this entire there's a group of thinkers, architects in India who talk about how the tradition of building should stay continuous as it was 200 years ago. That when a stonemason works, he should be able to do a stone flooring like his grandfather did 200 years ago. And I think that's extremely reductive to the point where it's almost like a kind of colonial,
paternalistic way of approaching knowledge.
So, absolutely. And Richard Sennett talks about craft as a function of the time that you're also kind of operating in. But I think what's important is that whatever we design as the object is of a particular context and place, but there has to be something systemic that comes out of it that not just we as architects can take away, but also the masons who actually work on it now have a means to do something that pushes their skill beyond what it used to be. It might be a complete departure from tradition, but so be it. I mean, if evolution is about that, right? So thank you. That was very instructive.
I like this conversation between India and China. I actually think that China, despite the fact that it's a very kind of recent, recent geography in the overall context of global architecture, it already achieved a certain identity. There is definitely a kind of Chinese architectural school. But at the same time, it's been around for at least a decade, maybe more, and it established a certain, well, it's in a state of refinement right now. And that's why it's less interesting, because we already know what's going to happen. They're not going to reinvent themselves unless they completely, new generation comes, and they are not going to be persuaded by regionalism, right? And they will bring something completely different. But what's interesting about India is that they're still looking for that identity. But at the same time, they're looking at, definitely as a collective project, because you can't separate his work from the work of a number of other Indian architects. And what unites them is what they find in India. So it's regionalism, it's regional. And it's based on using similar techniques and similar materials in, very original, very different, drastically different ways. But you can tell it's happening in India. So there is a certain collective search for what's going to be their identity. So China is not going to surprise us in the next several years, at least. We are very curious about what's going to happen in India, because that's slightly different. But I like to see how this develops collectively. And, we probably have like a dozen, maybe more architects who are really marching and producing quite a few projects. And so now we probably have like, I don't know how many dozens of projects that are very Indian.
You have the problem of scale and scaling. Like, how much can you scale this up? And the thing that's happened in China the last 10 years is beyond belief in scale. And
but the most interesting architects are working in small scale.
I have to say, India still has its diagram of its class structure and so on. And the Chinese broke that in horrible ways. But then after, there was this weird opening of a window for a short time, and that produced something, and just this massive urbanization, and unbelievable. And I'm not saying it's for India. I've understood enough that India has a whole different definition of what a city is than what we're used to, and is much more interesting in certain ways. But I still wonder, with the political turmoil that's going on there, how you can provide housing on a mass scale.
So I think the question now, with at least the kind of government that we have right now, is not how do you provide the housing, but what kind of housing do you provide? So the question really is that, because if you end up creating those warehouses for people, you can do that in quick time.
It's not what you want.
Exactly. Because the house in India, at least, and our first kind of book kind of said that to a certain extent, is the house is not just a means to kind of live; it's also a means for production. Especially in the lower incomes, where the use of the house changes temporally, and it is a place for people to sleep at night. In the day, people are actually working there. A housewife is giving tuitions maybe to other kids, make money from that. So the idea is that the idea of program is not tied within that kind of box definition. It's actually a box that's completely open to allow for any kind of program. So I think it's this idea of moving away from those kind of definitions, which actually COVID in some sense kind of did, right? We were all working from our houses. So it's not just core groups that were doing this now. We were all doing it. So I think that reality now is no longer limited to a certain class. It's now going to be across. Now, whether we are able to kind of start recognizing that possibility and creating or looking at typologies that respond to that or not, that's on us. Right? But I definitely think that the situation is, there is a point for us to kind of intervene. But it cannot again be from a point of, saying that we know everything. Right? It has to be the fact that, we collectively have to ask, what the questions are and kind of find answers together. Because, I don't think taking another kind of authoritative or a kind of, prescriptive role to the point where it becomes immutable is a solution for anything now. So yeah, but again, lots of questions, answers I hope we find along the way.
Do you have more questions?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.